So welcome everybody to another iteration of the Advanced Research and Writing Seminar, and indeed also another iteration of the Brandt virtual guest lecture series, which actually we did start during the heydays of Corona. In the very beginning, we started asking questions around Corona and how it changes the world, and now we move beyond the Corona topics and indeed explore other themes, including issues that may arise on the front of electoral politics, conflict, or even energy policy. So it is my great pleasure to host today Professor Marco Bünte from the University of Erlangen. My name is Andreas Goldthau. I'm the Consulting Chair of Public Policy, and essentially this is where my role ends, because I'll hand over to Achim, who will walk us through the evening and will also moderate the discussion. With that, Achim, the floor is all yours, and I'm looking forward to our talk.
Yes, thanks, Andreas. I'm happy to welcome you. Let me know, occasionally it seems that my microphone is a bit problematic, so then I need to speak more slowly, I guess. But actually, I don't want to talk very much. I just wanted to say that I want to welcome our guest for tonight. Professor Marco Bünte is a professor of political science at the University of Erlangen. Actually, not for long. I think you started last year somewhere, right? So 2019. Before coming to Erlangen, he was professor at Monash University in Malaysia, and that this also gives away a little bit his expertise. So he's an expert on politics in general, political procedures and political institutions, but with a special focus on the region of Southeast Asia. So he worked a lot on Indonesia, Malaysia, but also nowadays he moved more north towards Myanmar. So for us, this is very nice, because we don't really have so much regional expertise when it comes to the teaching staff at the University of Erfurt in this region. And I'm also obviously personally interested in Myanmar. That also was the idea of inviting Professor Bünte to us. We are very happy to have you here. It's a pleasure. It's a shame that we can't meet in person. Erlangen is not very far away, and part of the idea was actually to also sound out a little bit neighboring universities, so to speak, to think a little bit about how to network more across the region. So usually we would have invited you for a glass of wine. We have to do this later on virtually, but I have my wine already prepared. Okay, so without further ado, thank you very much for joining. We're looking forward to your talk. The talk, nonetheless, is very interesting and very timely, since we have just seen the election in Myanmar, and maybe we also have the chance to talk a little bit about this. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I would have actually like to come to Erfurt, because I have not been there, not even, I mean, after my return to Germany, but even before. So it would have been a great pleasure to come, but maybe we can do it next year, or after this whole mess has ended. So thanks for inviting me. My task for today is to present some of my ongoing research. And you have mentioned it, that we just had elections in Myanmar last week, and people have been quite enthusiastic again about the rather free elections. 5 years ago, the situation was the same. We had, again, the first free elections in 20 years after such a long period of military rule. And can you start the slideshow? So for me, as a political scientist, this this whole description of Myanmar as a democracy or as a democratizing system makes me feel rather uneasy, and because it veils the military prerogatives and military actions which are systematically encroaching on civil institutions in the country. So although Myanmar has been characterized as a hybrid regime or as a democracy, we have not really seen much debate conceptually in political science about these kinds of regimes. So basically, this was driving my research, was basically this uneasiness with the characterization of Myanmar as democracy or even hybrid regime. And secondly, in the field itself, there is something called tutelary regimes, but we haven't actually talked much about it. So this was basically the starting point of my research, which started with these two basic research questions. Can you do the next slide? So basically, the idea is how to model tutelary regimes in comparative politics, and then to show, on the case of Myanmar, how the military's interference helps the country to evade substantial democracy. So these are the two research objectives that I have with my presentation. And I would like to start, next slide, with the theoretical assumptions here. So far, we have seen a discussion about hybrid regimes in comparative politics over the last 20, 30 years. It started with hybrid regimes as which were then modeled as subtypes of democracy. The group of Wolfgang Merkel and Aurel Croissant and so on have come up with this idea that certain systems that do not really fulfill all requirements of a democracy should be called defective democracies, or there are basically, I don't know, maybe hundreds of subtypes of democracy, delegative democracy, and so on. And we find tutelary democracies in this. But a couple of years later, there was this movement within comparative politics which highlighted or emphasized the role of elections, and so basically driven with a dissatisfaction that we call something a democracy, though it is not. And out of this came a huge debate about the role of political institutions, and particularly the role of elections. And the term electoral authoritarianism was coined by Schädler and Levitsky and Way and so on. So another form of hybrid, this time as a subtype of authoritarianism, was coined. So basically we see these two options to model a hybrid regime, either as a subtype of democracy or a subtype of authoritarianism. There are options to model it as a residual category or an intermediary contrary, but this then needs two borders, two new conceptual. So basically, this is the state of the art. And when we look at tutelary regimes, we only find them as a form of democracy. As a form of autocracy, we do not have them, and we do not have them as a residual category. Next slide. My approach then is to call for a multidimensional approach, which takes some of the assumptions of a minimal democracy, basically the first two categories listed here, the electoral competitiveness, seen as having elected officials, universal suffrage, right to candidacy, and correctly organized free and fair elections. And then secondly, the civil liberties in terms of press freedoms, freedoms of association, and the rule of law. These are basically the minimal ingredients of a democracy. And I personally would say that what needs to be added in order to get a true understanding is a proper understanding of tutelary intervention, because a tutelary intervention basically decides decides about the role of elected governments. I personally do not see a tutelary intervention as a kind of binary of direct power relationships between political actors. So a government who controls the military or who does not control it. Instead, I would construct it as a specter of possible roles tutelary powers perform, depending on their role in the political system. So that would give them the role as rulers, decision makers, partners in governance, and veto actors. In order to truly make it this hybrid category, I feel that you need to have all and need to look at all of them. So this is one of my conceptual contributions. And I take this contribution to the case of Myanmar. And now I come to my descriptive part. Next slide. So the case of Myanmar is very particular because it takes the military as core actor. There might be other tutelary regimes where other actors loom large over the political system, like in Iran, the clergy, or here the military, and it is important to see this for the ongoing transition that Myanmar's military imposed this kind of transition from a position of strength in 2003. So basically it started without having faced a rebellion, without being invaded or whatever. So it decided to introduce this kind of political system from a position of strength. It took them 10 years to truly unfold this new tutelary regime. And at the core of this is the 2008 Constitution, which contains both liberal elements and illiberal elements, and which establishes a power-sharing agreement between civilian and military actors. And the military's role is pivotal here because it undertakes both legislative and executive tasks, and it is the guardian of the constitution, and so technically overseeing the political system. So, like what in Western countries, basically a constitutional court is doing, and is done by the military because it is such a powerful role over the political system. One core element is also the so-called coercive centralism of established by the 2008 Constitution, all lines of responsibility go to the central government, which is important because Myanmar is a multi-ethnic and multi-religious country, and with this kind of centralism, the central government controls some of the groups. So this is Myanmar as a case study. Let us look at the various elements. Next slide. We look at the elections in Myanmar. You can discuss about the fairness and freeness of both elections. We know there has been a lot of criticism about the disenfranchisement of the Rohingya and a number of other discriminations and so on. But in general, both in 2015 and 2020, the elections were as free and fair as can be expected in a young, fledgling democracy like Myanmar. And observers agree that citizens can pick their choice and elect their governments freely. Maybe the last elections in 2015 were even a bit freer because we have now COVID and everything, and we have quite a bit of discussions in Myanmar ongoing about the fairness of the election. But in general, the core actor, the military, has not interfered in the elections. And the question is why? After ruling for more than 5 decades, why did it not interfere into the elections? I would say that first, it installed the system, and secondly, it has learned to live with competition, basically because it installed a number of safeguards which protect the interests of the military, such as Article 59F, or the military proxy party, the USDP. Some of these safeguards eroded over time, but the military did not care because it had enough safeguards in place to live with it. For instance, the military representation in parliament, 25% of the elected seats are kept by the military. And when I thought about it and the election outcome and the landslide of the NLD, I thought the landslide might be related to that as well, because so if the USDP would have had 1/3 together with the military, it would be able to rule. So if the people want to have a counterweight against this, they vote for the NLD. So the election outcome of the NLD landslide, it is rooted in the first past the post system and all that. Yeah, definitely. But it might also be reflect this particular tutelary regime and the role of the military that is installed here. So that was the election, so we can discuss that, but I would move on and look at the military's role in particular in this tutelary regime. Can you put on the next slide? So the military, and this is often forgotten in the West, the military still rules because it remains in control of external and internal security. So when we have ethnic conflicts in Shan, when we have religious problems in Rakhine State. The military, and solely the military, decides about troop deployments. We have seen the Rohingya crisis in 2017, and the world asked itself, why is Aung San Suu Kyi not doing anything? Because she cannot. The military is solely responsible for the deployment of troops. Okay, Aung San Suu Kyi could have spoken out and could have criticized the whole reactions of the military to the security situation in Rakhine State, but it has not. Instead, Aung San Suu Kyi has opted to try to go into bed with the military. A second aspect, or further aspects, is that the military is solely responsible for military justice. So this is important when we look at those soldiers, for instance, which have been responsible for human rights violations in Rakhine State or even in Shan State. And the military can deal with it by itself. It is not really doing that very well. So far, only a few soldiers have been punished for what has been called missteps in Rakhine, for what the international community regarded as genocide or crimes against humanity. Additionally, the military is having complete control of defense issues. There is only a very superficial control of the budget by parliament, and it is also responsible for the internal administration of the army, which is important, for instance, in the discussion about the tenure of Commander-in-Chief Min Aung Hlaing. Normally, he should have retired long ago, but the military decided to extend it without discussion. It's problematic as well. Who is Min Aung Hlaing responsible to? So there is nobody. So this brings us to the difficult role or difficult relation between one ruler and the other. Next slide. So this is what has been called the cohabitation, or the power sharing between the civilian arm and the military arm of the government. So we see here a high degree of mistrust between both sides. We truly do not know whether there is any kind of regular meeting between both sides of the government. We see discussions about the role of the National Defense and Security Council, which should have should have come together to discuss issues of security. And normally this is the president calls for this body to convene, but Aung San Suu Kyi, the de facto ruler, has refrained from congregating this. The army has been furious about this, but it seems that the civilian government is truly afraid of bringing that body together. In Parliament, both the USDP and the military bloc tried to systematically undermine the legitimacy of the NLD government by calling the NLD unfit to rule and so on. It is not only a partner, it is additionally an opponent, and it is vetoing any changes. The right in the constitution to block any constitutional changes has been used in July and March 2020. So 2 times already the military has tried to stop any changes of its political role, basically arguing that military so far is not really ready for a withdrawal of the armed forces. The next slide. So this brings us to something that has been discussed quite often in recent years, and that is the decline in press freedom and civil liberties. So since 2017, we saw a slow erosion of press freedom and also a decline in civil liberties. Can you do the next slide and then afterwards come back? We see here, for instance, the number of political prisoners as is listed by the Association of Political Prisoners Burma. And we see since the NLD assumed power, there has been a rise in the number of political prisoners or those awaiting trial or those sentenced. So generally we see this is why Aung San Suu Kyi has been criticized. Can we go back one step? The reason for that is the existence of some sometimes very old laws like the Telecommunication Law or the Official Secrets Act, which have been used by the civilian administration to limit press freedoms and civil liberties. On the other hand, so when you look at the figures, we can say that it's half-half. Which means I think there have been some studies on the decline of civil liberties, for instance, and these lawsuits filed by the civilian government. We have, I think, half of it is filed by the civilian government and half of it is filed by the military. So the military is actively trying to interfere here as well. So it is approaching the press, for instance, when the press publishes something that sheds a negative light on the military, or which criticizes the military. At the same time, particularly those NGOs or CSOs are threatened that deal with the interests of the military, for instance, in the land sector, or in these issues. These are very vulnerable areas, and these CSOs are often intimidated by the military or those CSOs that are working in the areas of ethnic minorities. So this is also a reason. What you can see here is, again, the hybrid character. So it's on the one hand, maybe the weakness of the government, of the civilian government, and you can discuss a lot about why this is the case. But at the other hand, it often overlooks that the military is heavily involved in this as well. And although Aung San Suu Kyi and the current president has called for a strengthening of the rule of law, so far in the last few years, the rule of law has not been strengthened, hardly strengthened. The whole judicial system is in shambles. And in generally, we can say that the judiciary remains a pure administrative institution, and it is very often the military influence on the court system which lead to unfair trials or even improper trials. So the military here acts as a guardian and is actively weakening the rule of law. So the particular position of the military as above the political system is heavily impacting on the rule of law. So I would like now to conclude, and when you want to conclude, you can see that Myanmar has a very particular political system which is characterized by free and fair elections broadly, and substantial weaknesses in civil liberties, and a heavy influence of the military. And I argue that you should call this a tutelary regime and not a democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very concise and good overview, excellent overview over the regime characteristics of Myanmar nowadays. This is really fascinating because it is indeed an intriguing case, and there's a lot of follow-up questions I would have. But for the time being, I would just want the audience also to chip in. I think the best way would be to use the chat function. And Andreas and I will moderate this together probably, because I might overlook some. And Andreas would also invite those physically present, those select few that who are physically present to contribute to the discussion, of course. We will see whether this works out. For us, this technology is quite new. Yes, Andreas also mentioned that we should use to raise the hand. And in the meantime, while we are collecting questions, I take my derogatory rights of asking the first question. I have very few. Actually, I want to only make 2 points. First is your assessment, because the tutelary regime, if I understand it well, is something like where the ancient regime allows for a certain modicum of transition, but holding up the hand over the process and the institutions to that degree that they can actually maintain still their say in the bigger picture. And in this case, this would be the military itself. And the question is whether you see this as a stable form of regime, or whether it's kind of a transitory regime, because you said it's intermediate, but is this also in a temporal dimension view? I just think about, for instance, Chile, that is currently trying to undo the last authoritarian enclaves in the constitution after more than 30 years of Pinochet's demise. So is that a transitory or maybe even a sort of a stable outcome? And the other thing is, in how far, I mean, you see this as a competition or rather a relationship between Aung San Suu Kyi and her party on the one hand and the military government on the other. But is the Aung San Suu Kyi side really democratic, or is that, this typical criticism? Is that actually a force that drives the transition process even further, or do they also have their authoritarian kind of ideas about it? It's just basically speculation. So we start with these 2 questions, and in the meantime, we collect further questions. But thanks again for the talk, and looking forward to the discussion.
Should I answer the first questions?
Yes, I would say so. In the meantime, we still collect. Yes.
Okay. So normally in comparative politics literature, there is a discussion about the stability of these hybrid regimes, because they are always something in between, right? And I would argue that this is quite stable, because the military itself has not been surely disrupted like in Thailand or in other countries. It has not really seen revolutions where we have seen a recalibration of power and inclusion of certain groups and so on. So I would see that as something that is rather stable. The second question, and I agree with you that this is really speculation, but it's right, since it is a cohabitation. The civilian part, the Aung San Suu Kyi needs to be analyzed as well in their interaction with the military. And certainly they could have liberalized some of these older laws, and so the criticism directed against the Aung San Suu Kyi government is maybe right. And there are a lot of speculation about why this is actually happening. So whether she is either in cahoots with the military or whether she is actually building an alliance, of a Burman alliance against the ethnic groups. But again, I personally feel this is speculation, and I would only highlight the structural position the civilian government is in. It is very often straitjacketed by the military, and it is very vulnerable. And so when you think of that, the NLD has been repressed for 2 decades. Maybe it is no wonder that the NLD truly is very, very cautious in initiating far-reaching reforms, because that would maybe trigger a kind of backlash, the military, and might use this as an, I don't know, pretext to step into the political arena and take over directly again. And very often this is because in day-to-day policy making, in terms of social policies and economic policies, we do not see the military directly. So that is important to mention. This is why we have always, as the face of the government, is Aung San Suu Kyi, right? Because we are not really aware. She is elected, and she is de facto head of government because of this article put up by the military. But I feel that it needs to be highlighted that, and I mean, the question was whether she's democratic or not, but her constraints in my view, need to be stressed as well. Sorry for answering so long.
Excellent, excellent. No, I mean, we need to milk your expertise, if you don't mind me saying so. So that's great. I have next Moritz on the list, and then Shaw. But let's start with Moritz first.
Hello, Professor. I hope you can hear me. I'm live from WBS. Yeah, that's right. Thank you very much for your insightful talk. I also have some additional comments to make, because I also worked some time in Myanmar, so I was really interested in listening to your talk. Because you said the military did not really interfere in the election, I would have a little disagreement on that to some extent, because I think there were some reports, especially in Shan and Kachin state, when there was military operations against the counter-insurgency group of the ethnic armed organization in Kachin and Shan state, where there have been reportings that basically the military forced villagers to vote for the USDP, so like the military proxy party. And also why I think the military did not fully interfere during the NLD's first legislation was because, as you said, Aung San Suu Kyi basically failed to speak out against the atrocities that were committed against the Rohingya. So basically she was backing the military, and I don't know what would have happened if she publicly criticized the military. Then we would probably have seen something else. And now, yeah, I want to finish probably with a question, because when the NLD was inaugurated, in most of their like Aung San Suu Kyi's or the NLD's legislation was overlapped with the Rohingya issue essentially, and that will be my question. Like, what do you see the policy agenda of the NLD? Because they don't need to amend the constitution, as you said, they can do it. But what they could aim for is make like the push for like social welfare policies and something like that. I mean, this is definitely in their power. And the same was true for adopting this kind of telecommunication laws in order to, basically, underpin their democratic endeavor, so to say. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe let's pick this question. Let's pick this question, and then you answer first, and then I hand over to Job.
Okay. Thanks for the comments. The military has also been drawn into the recent elections by some opposition parties who voiced out their frustration that they were not allowed to run in some of the constituencies and so on. So this shows for me that the military is somehow used as a kind of referee and drawn into the political field. I agree with you that certainly the military would have liked the USDP to win. But at the same time, maybe in 2015, it was a bit different because the eyes of the world were looking at Myanmar. So they had this hands-off approach because the sanctions were still there. Now we have a little bit of different ideas. Nevertheless, I mean, so I think the full reports of the election observers did not really come out. And I did not read it. I read the press release of the Carter Center, which said, basically, okay. I mean, in COVID times, when there's only one party which is also organizing the elections, that cannot truly be free and fair. So I would agree to be a little more cautious. That was just for me, but it fit the argument quite nicely that, and I think, I mean, the outcome is also important, that the NLD won a landslide, maybe not because of manipulations, but because of this implicit role of the military and its people were trying to use this as a referendum. And I agree with you. I mean, the NLD could do much more. And, all the, you have been on the ground and in the country, so you know about the discussions about why the NLD is really not speaking out and really not initiating far-reaching reforms in terms of social welfare policies and so on. It could have done much more. And I'm not saying that the NLD is a democratic party, and Aung San Suu Kyi herself might not be a Democrat. That makes the case even more difficult, and for me to argue that this is a tutelary regime. But what is it instead? So this is what I agree with you that much more. I mean, in terms of reform, there are maybe some cultural. Her Burmese background is maybe limiting her to really and maybe capacities of the whole institutions to really reach out to ethnic minorities and convince them of her sincerity. They feel that she is in a coalition with the military government, right? So that is very frustrating, and so I wonder why such a huge number of ethnic minority groups then voted for her. I have not looked at the election results, to be honest. So I know that there are ethnic groups who have truly won the elections, and maybe the numbers are simply, the majority is simply that Burmese are much more in the center or important here election-wise. So
excellent. Yeah, the good thing is that we actually have two more Myanmar experts in our audience, namely people from Myanmar. And so I'm very glad to hand over to Shaw. The floor is yours, please, Shaw, if you want to put your question now.
Thank you, Professor Gameling. Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I have a few questions. During your lecture, you mentioned that the military is solely responsible for the atrocities in the ethnic states, and Aung San Suu Kyi cannot do anything, not much. Although some things that she did in the past might be controversial in terms of the perspective, like siding with the military, because back in December 2019, she defended Gambia's. She defended the military in the International Court of Justice, and also in early 2019, she and the military leaders discussed in the Security Council about the so-called crashing of the rebel ethnic armed groups. And also back in April 2020, the State Councillor's office, Aung San Suu Kyi's office, issued a letter praising military and the soldiers. So I feel like these kind of actions were controversial. I mean, she could have been like stay neutral in terms of supporting military actions, or she could also speak out. I mean, but I was wondering why she did such kind of like controversial actions. And my question is, at this rate, do you think NLD will still hesitate to challenge military involvements in politics and economy?
The defense against the Rohingya issue in The Hague, right? I mean, I think I said it before. All these, I do not defend or say that defend Aung San Suu Kyi in this case. A very controversial issues, and she could have spoken out, and there might be a number of reasons for why she hasn't. So either she is hoping to convince the military on a certain at a certain point of time, or to leave the political arena and so on, to initiate reforms of the constitution and all that. She is of the same mindset as the military. She is also, maybe she did not want to criticize the military because it's the institution her father founded. What else? So there actually might be quite a number of reasons why she didn't, electoral reasons. Going against or speaking out in favor of the Rohingya in Myanmar is political suicide. I personally see that there is a huge support for her. You know that. I mean, when I've been in Myanmar in March, there was this big sign: "We support you, Aung San Suu Kyi," and so on. So actually this kind of behavior led to a rally around the flag effect, and it might be the electoral reasons as well. So in order to not to go against her main constituency, the Burma heartland. So all that might come into play. But so when you see, for instance, her policies of erecting some Aung San statues in the ethnic minority areas, for instance, she could have easily given up on that. But she insisted on this kind of policy. So it might be that she's actually really of the same mindset where with the military. But we do not really know for sure. I would have loved to have her a kind of interview with her personal assistant, but he's not available whenever I ask. So it's very difficult to get this kind of, because it's these spaces have truly shut down after Thein Sein left office. So we are not really able to get this kind of information anymore because Aung San Suu Kyi is really closing herself up. And really, so she is not a Democrat. This is, Kim Jong-un has described as a double authoritarianism, right? You might see it like that, but that's not truly a proper political science term. So it's not really rooted in any of our options to carve out these concepts. So this is why I felt, okay, this might be much better to use this one, yeah. So I agree that there is space. Maybe, you asked a very important question about the NLD's ability or willingness to initiate reforms and go against the military. During my last interviews with the NLD, I asked about the military companies and whether the NLD would be willing to go against that. And they were very, very cautious and said it should not be. They should not have these companies, and actually, it's the people who should have them, and so on. So there's a lot. They are very influential, and so on. But future will tell us. So I think they are very hesitant to go against the military because they know of the power that the military still has.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. Next on the list, on my list, is Emeka Okoye. Would you like to pose your question directly? You also put it on the chat, but maybe you want to pose your question directly. You can.
So my question is on a possible return of sanctions in Myanmar. So my question is I believe that it's obvious that the military-civilian transition was employed to burnish the military's battered image after over 50 years of military rule. But with the increasing shrinking of the civilian space, do you foresee a return of sanctions for a transition?
Can you repeat? Is it a question about sanctions of the international community?
Yes, pre-sanction, there were sanctions, but after the transition, there was they cut back sanctions. So I'm trying to ask, do you foresee a shrinking of a return of sanctions following these events? Yeah, so there are, I think there are a lot of sanctions already in place against the military because for instance, the European Union and the US, they know exactly who is behind the violence of in Rakhine State and the Rohingya. They know about the complexity of the situation. So I would agree that I don't think that there is truly room for more sanctions, because that, I mean, Myanmar needs a kind of structural change, which also improves the lives of the people and builds up a middle class, and I don't know, all these kind of structural changes that put a kind of counterweight to the military. Also, because I mean the military is so powerful. Also, again, in these terms. So I would say that at the moment the international community is after the military, and when we see what happens in The Hague and also in the other court, we see that the international community wants justice for the Rohingyas. You can see what the international community is trying to push the military here, but nothing happens because the military is not able to see that.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Sorry, there was a quick interruption. I don't know whether this was only with me.
That was only with you.
Okay, I was frozen out. The vagaries of this technology. Yeah, that's fascinating. So I have Andreas next on the list, and then Gabriel.
Great. Thanks very much for a great talk and for a great discussion so far. That was a delight. Can I just ask two questions? One is, and you'll see, I know next to nothing about the situation in Myanmar other than me reading the newspapers and trying to follow. But maybe two questions. One is, if you could just comment a little bit on the political economy of the national economy of Myanmar. Essentially, my question here is, how does the military finance itself? How does it fund itself? Where does it where does it generate revenue? I mean, I have not studied Myanmar, but we had a little look at some point into Egypt for the sake of the argument, where the military literally owns whole industrial complexes, and that allows the military to evade the parliament's prerogative on the budget, which is what you alluded to before. You know, the department rubber stamps certain expense structures, but in the end cannot do very much. So my question is really, to what extent does the military dispose of alternative sources of funding, and as an extension, to what extent is the international community then in fact capable of targeting those revenue structures? Because if they're domestic, there's only so much you can do. But the second question that I would have is more a reaction to what you said before about the military trying to actively undermine not only press freedom, but also the public appearance of the NDL and of the NLD. But here the question for me is a little bit more about, you know, the effect of those efforts on democracy as a whole. Because in the end, you know, if a government, even if democratically elected, even if elected with a landslide victory, if they don't follow through with certain things, including reform processes, the delivery of public goods, you know, tangible benefits for people in terms of their lives getting better and welfare getting bigger and all these kind of things. That in the end does not fall back only on a party, it falls back on the system, and that is democracy. So my question here really is, do we see already, you know, some effect on public perception of democracy as a system, although it is a young system, but still something that may be negatively impacted by in the eyes of the public, given the constraints that you outlined? Thank you very much.
Thank you. 1 second.
your first question is very difficult to answer. I have written an article about the military funding, and I have to look at it again. Sorry. The reason is because there is not much work on the funding of the military. If I'm not wrong, and I was the first who have looked at this, and the sources are very difficult to get. So it has its own companies, but apparently these have been privatized. But at the same time, I hear that still the military uses them as a kind of pension system to keep up operations of the military. So basically, it's a self-funding organization, and it squeezes from the state budget still quite a lot of money. So much more than expenses for social and education infrastructure and so on. So, but I assume that is not even the major part, because I mean the civil wars that are ongoing in ethnic minority areas with a huge number of resources, and so we have. NGOs have worked on this, and they produced reports about the military's involvement in the jade industry, for instance. And but this is very unreliable data. I mean, you know that they are quite good nowadays in tracking all this and so on. So it's not so bad. But there you see that actually they the amount of money derived from these illicit sources might be really, really, really big. But you cannot really quote that as a kind of, okay, these sources come from that and so on. So we have natural resources, but we also have illicit drugs on the border area. So, and all these kinds of dark economy. And so this makes it very, very difficult, both for us as researchers and also for the international community to track these kinds of expenses or incomes. That is basically what is in the dark, and I assume that the military is quite keen on keeping all these sources of income for its own operations and so on. So I'm sorry not to be able to give you more concrete data on this. Second is the tangible benefits for the people. So we have this kind of regime now for 5 years, and we have 50 years of direct and indirect military rule. You can imagine that the people are setting all their eggs in Aung San Suu Kyi's basket, right? I mean, so they really believe that she is the only, and maybe the NLD and the next generation of politicians, that they are able to bring change. Public perceptions and attitudes towards democracy as a system. You can see quite a lot of authoritarian notions of democracy, which means so a government should be elected, certainly, but it is not necessary that a parliament controls this government. So it's a lot of traces of this long authoritarian past and an understanding of democracy as something something new and something that needs to be seen.
And I assume that everybody in Myanmar knows that it is not a proper democratic system. But the West is also saying, now we have democracy, right? I mean, so and at least there are some tangible benefits. I mean, trickle down there is a small middle class, and as in all these transition processes on the economic side, there are some benefits for elites, and in Yangon. When you look at Yangon, you see a totally completely changed place when you compare it to 2010, for instance. I mean, it's a different place to live in. So there might be some benefits already now, but it's still early days, right?
Perfect. Gabriel?
Excellent, thank you.
Gabriel, you are the next on the list.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And I have a couple of questions from my side. First of all, I noticed there's no peace aspect in your presentation, and I would like to ask you the peace process in Myanmar. And the military government, they tend to protect the country, and they say they will hand over the peace to the people and the ethnicity group, group, and the government. But there has been no improvement over the past years. So what do you think, why there has been no improvement in the peace process? That's my first question. And my second question is, you mentioned in your presentation that the press freedom, civil liberty, and rule of law aspect are deteriorating. There's more prisoners. And what do you expect the trend look like over the next 4 years during NLD government? And my final question is there any that catch your attention in terms of the relationship between China, India, and Myanmar compared to during their military regime in Myanmar, and then now with the NLD government? So has there been had any changes or the change of approach in terms of the relationship? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your questions. The peace process is a difficult issue, and I'm not truly sure whether the NLD thought that they could make peace within a year and just convince the ethnic groups to lay down their weapons, and they might have misunderstood the aspirations of some of the ethnic groups for autonomy and freedom and so on. So at the moment, I'm not so sure, because we have the war against the Arakan army and basically the second front coming up in Rakhine State, which then I think the military itself is also blocking at the moment any further talks, because they want to concentrate on this particular new dimension of the war. And it is very, very dangerous to add up to this whole mess of ethnic peace. I do not see with this constitution and with this political actors, I do not see progress on the peace front. I'm very negative about that. Maybe when I interviewed some of the military and some of the ethnic groups a couple of years back, they were all very positive, particularly because the open-mindedness of the military to changes maybe, but with the new government, this has somehow maybe the institutions are not in place to do that, and maybe Suu Kyi is not really having the trust of the ethnic groups. And so there needs to be a new approach, something completely new. And I mean, we have still, as in the past, these three actors, military ethnic groups and the democratic NLD government. Now it's the government. But we have discussed for the last 30, 40 years, how can we find peace? And so far, there's no progress whatsoever, because nobody is really truly to come up with something new. And I would argue that the military is having its role in the present system and does not want to give it up until there's peace. But at the same time, it is eroding the trust of the ethnic groups. So it's having its own role, which is self-perpetuating. So it is profiting somehow maybe from the civil wars, which discussed about the resources taken from some of the areas of the ethnic minorities maybe in the past, or and so I do not see progress on that front as well. In terms of China, India, Myanmar, it's very difficult. I mean, I know that this has been in the press recently with Aung San Suu Kyi and the military trying to go closer together with India in order to balance maybe China. But I do not really, I cannot truly answer that question because I do not know much about these developments recently. This has been out of my focus for a couple of years, and so sorry that I cannot really truly comment on this.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marco, for this very diverse set of questions, dragging you all over the place in Myanmar, so to speak. But also thank you very much for the questions. There would be obviously a lot of things to follow up. So we have a lot of students also from the region, largely defined or very broadly defined, let's say. So we could also think a little bit about whether there is something to conclude for other countries. But actually what I really would like to use the last couple of minutes for is to make use of your career itself, because we have quite some young researchers among us, students who have just started their PhD or maybe are in the first, second year or so. And given that you have now seen different academic systems, the German, the Malaysian, maybe even other ones, you also have experience from the GIGA, a research institute, versus a university. What would be, if you could give one piece of advice to our early stage researchers, what would that be?
That's a very difficult question, because I mean the German system is very, very difficult with all its, I don't know, old traditions that are in a way revoked, but at the same time still ongoing. So we have this culture, this academic culture of this, which is sometimes really. Yeah, it's different from the Anglo-Saxon world. So the Malaysian system is the Australian system. So I was in the Australian system, and I profited a lot from this kind of having a secure job, and then. But in the end, it is always not to be frustrated about, but really loving what you want to do. So for me, it was when I did my both my master and my PhD on Southeast Asian countries, so on issues, and I knew the Giga before, so this was my dream job. But still, then, I mean, academics now need to compete worldwide, but they can profit from this as well. So make use of the opportunities whenever you get them. Particularly these experiences abroad on conferences, on exchanges and so on are so important in order to motivate yourself for what you're doing in writing your PhD or writing your master's and so on. So all that is important to keep going, despite there are a lot of frustrations in between. And I was a lot, I mean, you know that we are sometimes, because of the sheer amount of work we have to do, a little bit frustrated. And we cannot see the bright side of it. And I would love to have a glass of wine with you afterwards, but I have to stick with my tea here. But in the end, it remains. You have to remain really resilient and energetic and overcomes all these hurdles because you love what you do. So. I think the German system and also the British model has both negative sides and positive sides. But what is important is that you love what you do. When you really love doing your PhD and you do not get up in the morning and say, "Oh God, again." I have to do this again. Then you stick to it, and you should not be demotivated by all these kinds of, I don't know, things that might come in between.
Excellent. What better words to conclude this exciting session? So that I think that's there's no way to better finish. But let me thank you, even if you can only toast with a cup of tea right now. Thank you very much. I will take the liberty to toast with a glass of wine. So, and I promise you the glass of wine at a later stage when physical meetings are again possible. But for the time being, thank you so much for joining. We will keep you also informed about activities of our institution. Please do so also with yours, and who knows, maybe there is some other forms of cooperation we could seek out in the nearer or midterm future. Let's see, but thank you so much for joining. I hope that everybody else also enjoyed this digital session. Also, hi again to those physical present. Thank you very much for Andreas organizing everything, and have a nice evening.
Yeah, thanks for all the nice questions. Very excellent questions. I had a lot of fun answering them, thinking about them, and so on. So very good. In Germany, it's very difficult to get really informed and good questions. You know, I mean, far away from Asia. So it's good to have these kinds of discussions. Thanks for the invitation.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ja, vielen Dank nochmal.
Ja, bitte, bitte.
Wir holen das nochmal nach bei Gelegenheit. Ja.